Our next speaker is one of New Zealand's leading legal minds and scholars and will be well known to most of you. Ani Mikaere is a barrister, a solicitor, and currently the kaihautu of te whare whakatupu mātauranga e te wānanga o Raukawa, where she also tutors in the Ahunga Tikanga program. Before she joined the wānanga, Ani also taught Māori law and Western law at the University of Auckland and Te Whare Wānanga o Waikato. Ani has published widely on the impact of colonisation on Māori and Māori legal practices, on biculturalism, on Māori self-determination, on te tiriti o Waitangi. Her most recent book, He Rukuruku Whakaaro, Colonizing Myths, Māori Realities, was co-published by Huia Publishers and Te Wānanga o Raukawa. Ani has clearly had a significant impact, not only on her discipline and the world of ideas, but also on her students, her colleagues, and others that she works with. One of her former students reviewed Ani's book, He Rukuruku Whakaaro, online. Yes, I was Google stalking you as well, Ani. And it captures so well what she does that I thought I should share it with you. The first time I read Ani's writing, I was stunned. Her writing is passionate, intelligent, brave, and clear. She doesn't disguise her emotions with academic disinterest. She speaks honestly about what drives her, be it despair, frustration, or wonder. She doesn't hide her assumptions and logic behind jargon or convoluted arguments. Her writing is so clear that her thoughts are exposed for the reader to judge. Often she takes a topic that is supposed to be complicated and strips it back to simple truths and lies. It is for all these reasons that I choose to continue to learn from her and why I am so excited about this book. Now, if only we all had student evaluations like that, Ani. Ko Raukawa te iwi, ko Ani Mikaere, nau mai, haere mai, Ani.
I te tuatahi, me mihi ka tika ki tō tātou kaiwhakarite i te ata nei, nō reira e te rangatira tēnā koe. Ko mihi a katoatia ngā mihi i ngā rangi ko pahure ake nei. Me pēhe au e whakanikoneko i ngā kōrero ātāhua, i ngā kupu ko puta, i ngā kai kōrero o mua, ko tāku, he tautoko, he tautoko, he tautoko. Nō reira, ko Ngāti Raukawa tēnei, ko Ngāti Pariraukawa, ko Ngāti Huia, e mihi atu nei ki aku whanaunga, no tainui waka, ki ngā haue whā, nō reira tēnā koutou. I just want to start by thanking you, Nala. I'm very honoured to be sharing the stage with this stunning young woman. And just listening to Nala speak, it reminded me, that sometimes we get a little bit muddle-headed here, and sometimes we almost think that we haven't got it that bad. But for me, directly beneath the veneer of partnership and directly behind the cloying rhetoric of principles and other such things, Nala, your battles are our battles. And I thank you very much for reminding us of that fact. Kāri a rikarika ngā mihi ki a koe. I have a few favourite uncles, but one of my favourite uncles has some advice that I often refer to when I have to stand and speak. And it was advice that I actually heard him giving to a bunch of young men who were learning how to whai kōrero. And his advice was pretty simple. It was, if you have nothing new to say nothing. And as someone who has to stand up and speak on the third day of a conference like this, if I were to take his advice, I'd actually sit down now. It's very hard to think of something new to say. So I had a very late night last night while I struggled and tried to figure out something new to say. And I apologise in advance if actually it's not very new at all. There's some pretty hard acts to follow here. But here I go. Theorising is part and parcel of what it is to be human. The term that we at Te Wānanga o Raukawa commonly used to describe the ever-expanding body of knowledge that has been produced by Māori thinkers and practitioners is the Mataranga Continuum. The Mataranga Continuum has been with us since our tūpuna first began developing theories to explain the nature of their reality, based on their observations of the world around them. It's been passed from one generation to the next. It's been developed by each generation in light of their particular circumstances. It represents the accumulated wisdom of all those who have gone before us, and it constitutes our connection with all those who will follow. In order to ensure our survival as a people, each generation must make a commitment to nurture the Mataranga Continuum. And I think that in many ways, what we've seen here during the last couple of days is a reaffirmation, indeed a celebration of our commitment to do just that. The central feature of a continuum, of course, is its continuity. And as we all know, we're not currently in the position of being able to take the continuity of our continuum for granted. The reason for that, of course, is that in recent times, a body of colonizing theory has arrived in our land, intent on stopping the Mataranga Continuum in its tracks. I have an 1858 quote here from a man who played a significant part in this energetic attempt at cultural annihilation, Francis Fenton. This is one of my favourite quotes, so I apologise if you've heard it before. He says, "The Māori is fortunate. A wise and a generous people, the English, have settled in his land, and this people are willing to teach him and to guide him in the well-made road which themselves have travelled for many generations. Let there now be no doubt nor hesitation, but be patient and earnest, and follow the direction of those who have been appointed to show you the right and the finished path." As this quote demonstrates so well, we were expected to change tack, to stop wandering around in the Mataranga wilderness, and to come onto the right and the finished path of Pākehā knowledge. To help us find our way, our colonisers obligingly tried to obliterate the memory of our own Mataranga, so that we would come to believe not only that their path was the right and the finished path, but it was actually the only path. As best summation of us as uncivilised folk who may not do any great amount of thinking established, we were actually incapable of theorising. This meant, therefore, that whatever we had was not theory, rather it was folklore. And moreover, whatever remained of our Mataranga was so distorted by their colonised interpretations that it became virtually unrecognisable to us. So how have we responded to this attempt to obliterate our Mataranga Continuum and to bring us into line with Pākehā ways of being? I believe that when the full force of colonisation first hit, our people were probably too busy just trying to stay alive to sit around pondering the preservation of the Mataranga Continuum. Many, probably most, were convinced that the only way to survive was to change direction and to walk this new and strange path. I've talked in other places about the excruciating choices that my grandparents must have felt forced into when they decided to keep the reo from their children and to push them down the path of Pākehā education. They were both born in the 1890s, and of course, as we all know, that was a time when everyone predicted that we were a dying race. They made impossible choices, choices without which I probably wouldn't be here today spouting on about the Mataranga Continuum. But that's just how things were for a while. Until our physical survival appeared to be secure, I think, until it became apparent that actually we weren't going to die out, we were going to be pesky and hang around. Only then, I suspect, did we have the luxury of being able to think beyond the immediate challenge of just staying alive to the question of what our change of direction may have cost us. And that's when groups like Ngā Tamatoa started pushing for change, fighting for te reo, striving to reverse some of the dreadful damage that had been done by the deliberate disruption of our ways of knowing, our ways of thinking, our ways of being. Eventually, what started out as a small band of radicals and activists who terrified the Pākehā public and embarrassed most Māori, gained some traction amongst their own. And so during the 1980s, 1990s, we had the growth of Kohanga Reo, of Kura Kaupapa Māori, of Wānanga, various other things, including Kaupapa Māori research. All of these initiatives have been efforts to resist the tide of colonisation, to escape from the right and the finished path that Fenton had written about, and to find our way back to the path that was laid out by our tūpuna. I don't think we're there yet, but we are in a really complex and fascinating and often exasperating place at the moment. If I can switch metaphors from paths to rivers for just a moment, rivers has been quite a common metaphor during this hui, of course, with the Waikato just out there. I think we are currently at the place where two opposing currents meet. We kind of know where we want to get to, but we've got a lot of choppy water, many swirling currents and eddies to get through before we can make it to those calmer waters. So I just want to spend the rest of the time that I have with you considering some of the things that we have to be mindful of as we try to navigate our way back to the channel that our people had been carving out and travelling along since time immemorial. The first thing we have to remember is that the system we're confronting has been set on a path of cultural domination for many centuries. It's developed a raft of tactics to deal with Indigenous peoples who have exhibited a determination to pursue our own agendas. As the colonising apparatus has ground relentlessly onwards, it has displayed an extraordinary capacity for maintaining its course. If we develop a pathway designed to lead to an outcome that differs from its own goals, say the realisation of tino rangatiratanga, it almost instinctively develops new strategies that will enable us to be brought back onto its original trajectory, for example, by defining rangatiratanga as iwi, self-management. Kohanga Reo is a great example of how this process has played out, and I'm not going to go through all the details because you know what happened with Kohanga Reo. Great initiative, burgeoning numbers, 800 and something across the country in the 1990s, or 1994. But when the Ministry of Education came in and took over from the disestablished Department of Māori Affairs, what followed was underfunding, regulatory control, totally inappropriate, and what we had was the Ministry, the Crown, basically trying to strip the kaupapa out of kohanga, and terrible results followed. So serious that the Trust had to take the Crown to the Tribunal a year or two ago. This pattern of development, whereby the early potential of an initiative is largely thwarted by Crown interference posing as support, has been repeated throughout numerous spheres of activity. I could name Kura, I could name Wānanga, I could name Waitangi Tribunal, we could go on and on. So, while celebrating the imagination, the dedication and the sheer bravery shown by those who were involved in the design and early implementation of these initiatives, we can't afford to get misty-eyed in our assessment of what has been achieved. We know that the reality of our progress has rarely matched the rhetoric. We need to be honest about this, not defensive, not defeatist, just honest. We also need to think very carefully about what the coloniser has stood to gain from seeking to obliterate from our memory the fact that the Mataranga Continuum ever existed. Convincing us that we never had a distinctive intellectual tradition achieves a number of quite crucial things. Firstly, it asserts that there has only ever been one true intellectual tradition, theirs. The work that we are now doing is therefore defined as a deviation from the norm of Pākehā research. Secondly, it asserts the universality of Western thought. This means that the work we are doing now is merely a subset of their intellectual tradition, and that means that we therefore are contained by them. Thirdly, it allows them to construct a definition of our progress that takes as its starting point a moment in time when we had nothing, which in turn produces a deceptive sense of how well we are doing, because anything is better than nothing. Now, of course, it's tempting for us to think, well, these are just the time-honoured tactics employed by the dominant in order to maintain their dominance. We know what they're up to, and we're not fooled by any of it. And yet, to a degree, yep, that's right. However, whether or not we care to admit it, Most of us toil away inside structures established by and for the dominant, and it's really difficult not to become infected by the way in which they continue to characterise our present reality. Given that most of us don't yet have the luxury of working in coloniser-free environments, we need to pay very close attention to the range of ways in which these environments chip away at our sense of reality, lowering our expectations of what might be possible. So I want to talk a little bit more about what it means to work in these environments, where our Māori space is often encircled by those who continue to view it as a deviation from the norm, or who expect us to be grateful for any small crumb that is thrown our way. It's really important first to salute the enormous amount of work that's been done over the years by people like Linda and Graham, Leonie and others, who had the audacity to suggest that Māori had our very own intellectual traditions, our own philosophical frameworks, and our own approach to the maintenance, transmission, and expansion of knowledge. These ideas would have been quite some revelation to the Pākehā Academy 25 years ago or so. And in that bastion of Western research privilege, the university, it would have taken real courage to articulate, to defend, and to give substance to the ideas underlying kaupapa Māori theory. However, now that the groundwork has been laid, I think it's really important to ask whether we continue to exhibit that same degree of courage in the work that we do. If asked to research into Māori and constitutional issues, for example, do we limit our examination to such matters as the retention and numbers of the Māori seats? Or do we tackle head-on the illegitimacy of Crown sovereignty and the need to restore tino rangatiratanga te iwi and hapu? If contracted to look at Māori and the criminal justice system, do we focus on the range of factors that render Māori more prone to offending? Do we extend our brief to consider the racism of the state legal system and its treatment of Māori suspects? Does it even occur to us to examine the relevance of the Crown's own historic and contemporary criminal behaviour to any consideration of the relationship between Māori and the illegal state legal system? If we're asked to participate in a research project with Pākehā colleagues, do we challenge the parameters of the project if we know in our hearts that it's failing to ask the questions that Māori want answered? Or do we agree to provide the Māori perspective that enhances their project without questioning the flawed premises that underpin it? If we're enrolled in a PhD, do we take the risk of trying to develop a kaupapa-based way of conducting the work and presenting our findings? Or do we follow a formulaic approach which meets Western research expectations, thereby securing a relatively smooth path towards a timely completion? Do we really believe that presentation and defence of a written thesis is the only way to prove ourselves at the doctoral level? Why can't an artist produce a piece of work and present the thinking that's gone into that piece of work in order to complete the qualification? Why can't the composition, performance and explanation of a mōteate fulfil the requirements of a doctorate? Not an honorary doctorate, but a doctorate. Is a doctorate the only way to prove ourselves? What are we trying to prove, and to whom? When Linda wrote Decolonising Methodologies, she described kaupapa Māori research as an attempt to retrieve space. Now that the space has been retrieved, what are we doing with it? Are we content just to remain within a niche that has been carved out by others, convincing ourselves that we're being really brave just by simply treading in the footsteps of those who first dared to deviate from what the coloniser deemed normal? Complacency is an ugly term, and I know Linda told us not to be mean. But we do need to be mindful. We need to be aware of the dangers of becoming complacent. If we don't work constantly to defend the kaupapa Māori space, we risk it being gradually eroded by the Western research environment that surrounds it and that seeks to contain it at every turn. If we are not constantly awake to the perils of being encircled by that environment, we can so easily find ourselves complicit in enabling others to poach the bits of kaupapa Māori theory that they think will enhance their work, reshaping it to suit their own agendas. We must be prepared to examine our own work rigorously and constantly, lest we slide unwittingly towards the point where in fact we're conducting our work in much the same way as Pākehā researchers do, but hiding behind the kaupapa Māori label. One of the other problems of working in environments like these is that we can really easily wind up spending our entire time in defence mode. If we're not careful, we can end up expending all of our energy just fighting to retain whatever gains have been made, which becomes an exhausting and ultimately quite non-productive exercise. We can't afford to get locked into a permanently reactive stance, numbing our creativity and stunting our potential in the process. Because the truth is, we don't just have the task of pulling away from the path of colonised ways of being. While we've been on this path, and while we continue to struggle against the colonisers who are trying to keep us on the path, our own path has fallen into disrepair. The Mataranga Continuum has been neglected. It's been abused. It's been distorted. It needs our full attention. If we're going to fulfil our obligations as kaitiaki of the Mataranga Continuum, at some point, and I would suggest sooner rather than later, we have to find a way to prioritise its reclamation, its restoration, and its expansion. It needs to become our central focus, our touchstone. And something really interesting happens when it does become our touchstone. For example, if we were to revisit the question of measuring our progress, in light of the Mataranga Continuum, what might we take as our starting point for that exercise, for measuring our progress? Would we take te kore as our starting point? Would we take the moment when Kupe first decided to come to Aotearoa? Might we go back to the time when groups of our ancestors made preparations to come here on Tainui waka and on other waka? Would we choose a time when the uri of those early voyagers had settled into their new environment and had developed a body of knowledge that was specific to this land? Would not the question, how far have we come, be answered rather differently if we took any of these as starting points, as opposed to adopting quite randomly a date of 25, 50 or even 100 years ago? And perhaps more importantly, would not our concept of what is normal be understood rather differently if considered in the context of the Mataranga Continuum? When viewed against the backdrop of our history since time immemorial, it's ridiculous to allow our construction of normality to be dictated by the utterly abnormal events of the past century or so. There's nothing normal about Western theoretical frameworks assuming centrality in the space that is Aotearoa. In the context of the full breadth of our history, normal describes a situation where we have full control over the development and the application of our theory based on our philosophical traditions. That, with the exception of the brief aberration that has occurred in recent times, is the way it's always been. So what does it mean for us to accept as normal the obligation to nurture and develop the Mataranga Continuum? It means trusting in the accumulated wisdom of generations past, while understanding that we must be prepared to build upon that wisdom and to innovate in light of our current circumstances. Every generation has done this. It's probably worth noting too that the pace at which innovation and development has occurred is most unlikely to have been constant. There will have been key points in our history when life has presented particular challenges, and at these times the need for innovation would have been urgent. A more focused commitment to expanding the continuum would have been necessary in order to ensure our survival. Looking at my own iwi history, one of these occasions would have been when we decided to migrate across Te Moana Nui Akiwa to come here. Another would have been when we responded to pressures that we were facing here in Waikato and decided to move south. In my view, now is another such key moment in our history. The particular challenge that we are facing is the interruption to the Mataranga Continuum that has been inflicted by a colonising culture hell-bent on our annihilation or assimilation. Same thing, really. Special circumstances warrant special efforts and demand heightened commitment. Making that commitment is both our responsibility and our privilege. What this might mean in practice is probably going to be different things for different people. Leone has lamented the depoliticisation of kaupapa Māori theory, urging us to remember that the tino rangatiratanga principle has to be part of everything that we do, that we put under the banner of kaupapa Māori. Linda has stressed the importance of thought, of imagination, of not being constrained by other people's constructs. She's also talked about the significance of not being comfortable, reminding us that being irritated is good for our thinking. I think that I would add to this little list the value of trepidation, of experiencing a degree of anxiety about where a line of inquiry may lead, but making a decision to follow it anyway. When I first started looking into the origins of the patriarchal elements in contemporary tikanga, I was more than a little nervous about what I might find. When I was asked to deliver my findings in front of an audience which included my own aunties and uncles, I was absolutely terrified. This scenario of terror in the presence of my elders has been repeated many times over the years, as my curiosity has led me to explore a range of mostly contentious issues and ideas. In fact, it's been repeated so often that I found myself wondering whether I'm actually capable of finding a topic worth exploring that doesn't induce the fear factor. Now, despite my efforts to build a kind of a nonchalant feel the fear and do it anyway attitude towards my work, a project on which I'm currently working has provided a humbling reminder of my essential faint-heartedness. I've been enrolled in a tohu called Te Kāurutanga, the most senior degree being offered by Te Wānanga o Raukawa. I've been enrolled in it for more years than I care to remember. Some people in this room will know what I'm talking about. This degree will be conferred by the founding iwi of the Wānanga, Te Ātiawa, Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Tōrangatira. I report to a group of elders, Ngā Purutanga Māori, who are the guardians of tikanga and kawa at the Wānanga, who act as senior scholars and advisors on a whole range of issues that are important to the Wānanga. My supervisory team for this project consists of Ngā Purutanga Māori and a group of other advisors who have very generously agreed to be involved. Some of them are here today. Now, for several years now, I've been floundering, producing chapters that skirt around the edges of the topic that I've been struggling to articulate with any degree of precision. I've found numerous excuses for the fact that I haven't been making better progress, and I'm sure some of these excuses will be familiar to some of you. Too busy teaching, too much administration, too many meetings to attend, too many conference papers to write, too many this, too many that. The truth of the matter is not that I've been too busy, it's that I've been too scared. I've been too scared to explain to Ngā Purutanga Māori exactly what it is that I want to focus on. When I look back at the work I've done over the years, I know that all paths have led me to this topic, and yet when it has come to describing the topic with precision to my own aunties and uncles, my courage has completely failed me. Perhaps I should explain a little more fully. For a long time now, I've been interested in the degree to which colonisation has changed the way we look at the world, at the extent to which our philosophical frameworks and the practice of our tikanga have become contaminated by Western thought. I've looked at the influence of patriarchy and more generally at the hierarchical thinking that seems to infect so much of what we sometimes unquestioningly accept as tikanga. In my search for explanations for the contradiction that exists between what many of us accept as fundamental Māori concepts and the way that tikanga is often implemented in contemporary times, Christianity has invariably been heavily implicated. When I enrolled in Te Kāurutanga, I knew that I had to focus on my own iwi, Ngāti Raukawa. Given that the degree is to be conferred by the iwi, it kind of seems obvious that it should result in work that might be of value to the iwi. It's also fair to assume that successful completion will require me to venture into territory that has not previously been traversed. There's no point rehashing material, no value to be found in rehashing material to which the iwi already has access. So tackling a project of this nature that ventures into new territory requires a degree of intimacy with the subject matter that, in my view, only a whakapapa relationship can make possible. So far, so good. But I faced a real dilemma. Those of you who are familiar with Ngāti Raukawa will be aware that the missionaries arrived in Aotearoa shortly before Te Tiriti o Waitangi started being touted around our district for signing. You will also probably know that one of the earliest joint projects contemplated by Te Ātiawa, Ngāti Raukawa and Ngāti Tōrangatira, and one which continues to instill a high degree of iwi pride, is the Anglican Church, Rangiatea. Erected in Otaki during the late 1840s and lovingly rebuilt following its destruction by fire in 1995, Rangiatea stands as a powerful symbol of our historical and continued allegiance to Christianity. I grew up with a grandmother, aunties, uncles who were staunchly loyal to Rangiatea. Every month they would attend the monthly service conducted at our marae, Ngā Tukuwaru. by the minister who would come from Rangiatea especially for that purpose. On top of that, they regularly attended services at Rangiatea itself. Fundraising for the church seemed to be a constant feature of their lives. The artwork within our whare tupuna makes numerous references to Christianity. Christian ritual seems to have woven itself throughout our practice of tikanga, both on the marae and in the home. Over the years, I have formed the opinion that Ngāti Raukawa is probably one of the most Christian iwi in the country. How then to admit to my elders that what I wanted to investigate more than any other topic was the idea that Christianity has had a negative impact on our tikanga? How to explain to them my hope of developing a theory that might explain how Christianity has impacted upon Ngāti Raukawa in ways that put our very survival at risk. How to examine the decisions of various of my tupuna to convert to Christianity without being seen as questioningly their judgment. How to raise questions, this is probably the hardest actually, how to raise questions about something so intimate as personal faith without upsetting or hurting the people for whom I have the greatest respect, people about whom I care deeply. These are just some of the imponderables that hounded me as I wrestled with my topic and tried to show progress by skirting around the edges of the issues that I really wanted to tackle. The truth is, I wasn't going anywhere fast, and it got to the point where I was almost completely paralysed by anxiety. Last September, I was presented with an opportunity to break my self-imposed gridlock. Deeply embarrassed by my lack of progress, I decided I had to take the chance. One of the themes at the Keynote Te Pai conference, for which we published the proceedings the other night, which was hosted jointly by ourselves and NZCR at the Wānanga, was to examine the impact of colonisation on tikanga. There, in the presence of an audience full of relatives and workmates, and under the watchful eyes of ngā purutanga Māori who sat right in the front row, I finally talked openly to them, really, more than anyone, about my feelings with respect to Christianity. I don't think I've ever been so nervous. To describe the feedback following my presentation is as humbling. To describe that as humbling is a massive understatement. One of my cousins told me thoughtfully that upon reflection, her mother, my auntie and one of the staunchest monthly churchgoers at Ngā Tukuwaru, would have enjoyed my kōrero. She had to go and think about it for a while, but she did and came back, and that's what she said. And she said, it's time for our generation to have this discussion. An uncle who is heavily involved in the church spent quite a long time talking to me about my kōrero and urged me to pursue it. His exact words were, you must do this work. One of my deeply Christian aunties, while looking a little bit puzzled at my choice of topic, has remained as supportive and as loving as ever. Another of my uncles, without whose assistance completion of the project would frankly be impossible, has indicated his firm support, has indicated his interest in the theory, and has agreed to set aside time for me to interview him. He's already revealed some extraordinary insights into the behaviour of my tupuna that have made me realise just how superficial my understanding of my own history really is. So, having allowed anxiety and doubt to get the better of me for so long, I'm now feeling excited about my topic. My supervisors in the room might be really glad to hear that. And highly motivated to test my ideas, regardless of what I might find. I've been reminded, even from the small amount of information that has been shared with me so far, how much more there always is beneath the surface of historical accounts. I realise, with a bit of a thud, how my understanding of my own tupuna is shockingly one-dimensional, and that I've been guilty of believing far too much of what has been written and reproduced about them. I'm more than a little ashamed at having underestimated the capacity of my elders to embrace ideas that may not necessarily correspond with their own. And I'm mortified to think that I doubted for one moment their support for me, regardless of whether or not they agree with my views. I also have to live with the realisation that my querulousness prevented me from fulfilling my obligations as a kaitiaki of the Mataranga Continuum. Christianity has constituted a major interruption to the development of our mātauranga, and one of the reasons for its success has been the extent to which it has demanded and won the loyalty of our people. Challenging the hold that it has had on my iwi was never going to be easy, but that doesn't excuse my tardiness in confronting my fears so the project could move forward. Given the extreme pressure that our mātauranga has been subjected to during the past 2 centuries, it's to be expected that the struggle to reclaim and to expand it will often be difficult. I have been inspired by the fearlessness of others who have taken up the challenge to do this important work. Take, for example, the groundbreaking writing of Ngā Huia Murphy on the significance of menstruation according to tikanga Māori, or the pioneering work by Kim McBreen on framing a kaupapa-based understanding of sexuality. Quick sales pitch, both of these extraordinary writers are in our conference proceedings. Witnessing the intellectual bravery of these young women as they tackle subjects that generations of colonised attitudes have classified as no-go zones should fill all of us, as it does me, with hope for the future. I'm sure I'm nearly over time, but I'm coming to the conclusion part. Okay. Today, as we find ourselves surrounded on all sides by a colonising presence that blindly asserts the universality of its peculiar way of perceiving the world, in light of this reality, it's probably inevitable that some of our time will be spent defending the kaupapa Māori space, a space that has been carved out during the past 25 years through a potent blend of imagination, determination and effort. But we mustn't forget that our tūpuna have been developing the Mataranga Continuum for an eternity before these strangers arrived with their own theoretical traditions and assumed the right to impose them upon us. But for their intervention, the Mataranga Continuum would have continued to develop uninterrupted. Who knows where our theoretical traditions may have led us? We'll never know the answer to that question, but that doesn't really matter. We can't change what's happened. It's what we do now that really matters. Are we going to allow others to dictate the direction in which our mātauranga grows, or the pace at which that growth occurs? Will we become so preoccupied with responding to their demands that we neglect our own intellectual traditions? Or will we fully reclaim our responsibilities as kaitiaki of the Mataranga Continuum, prioritising its recovery and expansion ahead of all other potential distractions? I'm not suggesting for a moment that doing this work is easy. Many years I came across a turn of phrase that has always kind of appealed to me. It was the suggestion that we all have sore spots in our thinking, in respect of which we develop a range of defence mechanisms to deceive ourselves, to protect ourselves, to extract ourselves from uncomfortable situations. As a people who have been battered by colonising thought for several generations, we probably have more than our fair share of sore spots. Accepting our obligations as kaitiaki of the Mataranga Continuum requires us to acknowledge and tackle those sore spots. It means being honest with ourselves. It means opening ourselves up for potential criticism. It means being prepared to accept a level of discomfort. Now, none of this may sound particularly inviting, but the degree of satisfaction, even exhilaration, that can flow from knowing that we have played our part, no matter how small, in the epic task of reclaiming what is rightfully ours, can be inspiring, can be surprising as well. On the other hand, failure to play our part will make us shamefully complicit in the withering of an intellectual tradition that makes us unique in the world. We are talking about survival here, for without our mātauranga, who are we? The options, therefore, I think in the end can be laid out in fairly stark terms. Contribution or complicity, exhilaration or shame, the choice is ours. Tēnā tātou.